I want to tell you about the richest man I ever knew. Not rich the way the world means it now, though he was that too, once. I mean rich in the way that Jesus talked about, when he said a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. But before Robert Sterling became that kind of rich, he was the other kind. The kind that gets your name on buildings and your face on magazine covers, and your phone number in the contact list of senators and celebrities and people who only call when they need something. And he was miserable. Robert Sterling was worth $2.3 billion. I am going to say that number again because it is important that you feel the weight of it before you hear what he did with it. $2.3 billion. He built that fortune from nothing. No inheritance, no family connections, no Ivy League degree. He grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens with a mother who cleaned office buildings at night, and a father who drove a cab until his back gave out and then drove it some more because the rent did not care about his back. Robert was 16 when he wrote his first line of code on a second-hand computer he bought at a pawn shop with money here and bagging groceries. He was 19 when he dropped out of community college to start a software company and a storage unit he rented for $150 a month. He was 23 when he landed his first major client. He was 28 when his company went public. He was 32 when he made his first $100 million, and he was 48 years old, standing in the penthouse of a Manhattan high-rise that he owned outright, looking out at a city that sparkled like a circuit board beneath him, holding a glass of whiskey that cost more per bottle than his mother used to make in a month, when he realized that he had spent his entire adult life building an empire. And somewhere along the way, he had lost everything that mattered. The penthouse was 6,000 square feet. It had floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. It had art on the walls that a dealer had selected for him. Modern pieces, abstract, expensive, chosen not because Robert loved them, but because they were appropriate for a man of his stature. It had a kitchen with Italian marble countertops where no one cooked. It had a dining table that seated 12 where no one sat. It had 3 bedrooms that no one slept in because Robert's ex-wife had taken everything that was not bolted down in the divorce. And his 2 adult children, David, 24, and Sarah, 22, had taken their mother's side, which meant they had taken the side of anyone who was not Robert, which meant he had not heard from either of them in over a year, except through lawyers. He stood at that window every night. It was a ritual. He would come home from the office at 10 or 11, sometimes later, pour the whiskey, and stand there looking at the lights. Millions of lights, millions of lives, millions of people in their apartments, in their restaurants, in their taxis, going somewhere, coming from somewhere, connected to someone, and Robert was above them all, literally above them on the 63rd floor, looking down. And the distance between himself and all those lives felt less like elevation and more like exile. He could not sleep. He had not slept well in years. Not since the divorce. Maybe not since before that. The insomnia was a creature that lived in his penthouse with him, the only roommate he had, and it kept him company through the long hours between midnight and dawn when the whiskey stopped working and the silence of 6,000 empty square feet pressed in on him like something with weight. He would lie in his bed, a custom mattress, $10,000. The kind that was supposed to conform to your body and cradle you into perfect rest and stare at the ceiling and think about numbers. Revenue projections, market share, quarterly earnings. The numbers scrolled through his mind like the stock ticker on the bottom of a news screen. Relentless, unending, meaningless. Not meaningless to his shareholders, not meaningless to his board of directors, not meaningless to the financial analysts who tracked his company's performance with the intensity of cardiologists monitoring a heartbeat, but meaningless to Robert, because somewhere between the first 100 million and the second billion, the numbers had stopped feeling like achievements and started feeling like chains. He had a private jet, a Gulfstream G700. He had used it 11 times in the past year, all for business. He had a yacht, an 80-footer docked in the Hamptons. He had been on it twice. He had cars, a Porsche, a Bentley, a vintage Aston Martin that he kept in a climate-controlled garage and never drove because he was afraid of scratching it. He had a house in Aspen that he visited 1 week a year. He had a membership at a golf club where the initiation fee was $300,000, and he had played exactly 4 rounds in 3 years. He had everything. He had everything, and he had nothing. And the contrast between those two realities was so absurd, so grotesque, so perfectly illustrative of something Jesus said 2,000 years ago about gaining the whole world and losing your soul. That, if Robert had been the kind of man who read the Bible, he might have recognized himself in it. But Robert was not that kind of man. Not yet. He went to church occasionally. Christmas, Easter, the social events, the galas. He wrote checks, large ones, 6 figures, sometimes 7, to churches and Christian organizations, because his financial advisor told him it was good for his public image and his tax situation. The Robert Sterling Foundation donated millions every year to causes that sounded impressive in press releases. But Robert himself had not sat in a pew and listened to a sermon with an open heart since he was a boy, sitting next to his mother in a Catholic church in Queens, swinging his legs because they did not reach the floor. That was a long time ago, a lifetime ago, $1 billion ago. And on this particular night, a cold Thursday in December, 6 days before Christmas, Robert stood at his window and looked at the lights and felt something he did not usually allow himself to feel. He felt alone, not lonely. He had felt lonely before, and he knew how to manage it. He managed it with work, with meetings, with the perpetual motion of a man whose calendar was so full that he never had to sit still long enough to confront what was missing. Alone was different. Alone was not an absence of people. It was an absence of purpose. It was the realization that if he disappeared tonight, if he simply ceased to exist, the company would replace him, the board would elect a new CEO, the stock price would dip and then recover, and within 6 months it would be as if Robert Sterling had never lived at all. His children would inherit money they had not earned and would not miss the father who had earned it. His business associates would attend a tasteful memorial service and then go back to making deals. The city below would keep glittering, indifferent. He drained his whiskey. He set the glass on the windowsill, and he went to bed, knowing he would not sleep. Not knowing that in less than 48 hours, a homeless man named William would ask him a question that would dismantle his entire life. But one cold December night would change everything Robert thought he knew about wealth. Christmas Eve. Robert had spent the day in the office because the office was the only place where his existence felt justified. There was a deal closing in January, a major acquisition, 9 figures, and he had used it as an excuse to call meetings that did not need to happen and review documents that had already been reviewed just to fill the hours. His assistant, a patient woman named Claire, who had worked for him for 7 years, had set a small wrapped gift on his desk before she left at noon, a card that said, "Merry Christmas, Mr. Sterling." He had opened the gift, a leather-bound journal, nice, thoughtful, and set it aside without writing in it. He left the office at 9:30. The streets were different on Christmas Eve, quieter in some ways, louder in others. The restaurants that were still open glowed with warmth and laughter. Couples walked arm in arm. Families herded children bundled in winter coats. Everyone was going somewhere. Everyone had someone waiting for them. Robert walked. He usually took a car service, but tonight he walked. He did not know why. The cold was sharp. The kind of New York December cold that finds every gap in your clothing and punishes you for it. His overcoat was cashmere. His scarf was Italian wool. His shoes cost more than most people's monthly rent, and they were not designed for walking in slush. but he walked anyway. It was on 53rd Street, in the block between 6th and 7th Avenues, that he saw the man. He was sitting on the sidewalk with his back against the wall of a closed storefront. He had a thin blanket wrapped around his shoulders, a blanket so inadequate for the temperature that it might as well have been a napkin. He wore a coat that was more patches than original fabric. His shoes were held together with tape. His hands were bare and red and cracked from the cold. He was not asking for money. He was not holding a sign. He was just sitting there, hunched against the wall, trying to take up as little space as possible, the way homeless people learn to do when they understand that the world would prefer they were invisible. Robert saw him and kept walking. That is what you do in New York. That is what everyone does. You see and you keep walking, because if you stopped for every person sitting on every sidewalk in this city, you would never get anywhere. You learn to look through them, to let your eyes slide over them the way water slides off glass. You learn to not see. Robert was very good at not seeing. He had been doing it for decades, and he would have walked past William without a second thought, the way he had walked past 1,000 other men and women in the same situation. Except that something happened. He slipped. A patch of ice on the sidewalk. His expensive shoes had no traction, and his right foot went out from under him, and he stumbled, caught himself on a parking meter. And in the process of catching himself, he looked down right into the man's face. Their eyes met. And in that fraction of a second, that involuntary, accidental moment of genuine human contact, Robert saw something that stopped him. The man was old, 60, maybe 65. His face was weathered in a way that spoke not just of age, but of exposure, years of sun and wind and cold and rain, with no shelter to soften the assault. His beard was white and matted. His cheeks were hollow, but his eyes were clear, not clouded by alcohol or drugs or the glassy vacancy of mental illness. Clear, present. And this was the thing that Robert could not account for, the thing that snagged in his mind like a thread catching on a nail. Peaceful. Those eyes were peaceful, not resigned, not broken, peaceful. The way a man's eyes look when he has made peace with something that most people spend their lives fighting. Robert straightened up. He brushed off his coat, and instead of walking on, he stood there. He did not know why. He stood there on the sidewalk in the freezing cold on Christmas Eve, looking at a homeless man with peaceful eyes. And something inside him would not let him move. The man looked up at him and said, in a voice that was rough but steady, "Cold night." "Yes," Robert said, "it is." The man nodded. His breath came out in a cloud. He pulled the thin blanket tighter. Robert stood there for another 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, a war was fought inside him. The war was between the man he had become, the man who kept walking, who not saw, who wrote checks from a distance and considered his obligation met, and something else, something older, something that might have been the boy from Queens who used to sit next to his mother in church and listen to stories about a man who touched lepers and ate with sinners and said, "Whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me." The older thing won. "Come with me," Robert said. "There is a cafe on the corner. Let me buy you something warm." The man looked at him, studied him, not with suspicion, but with something that looked like recognition, as if Robert were someone he had been expecting. They sat in the cafe, a small Greek diner that was open late on Christmas Eve, run by a family that had been there for 40 years. Robert ordered coffee and a full meal for the man and a coffee for himself. The waiter brought the food, and the man ate slowly, deliberately, with a gratitude that was visible in every bite. He did not eat like a man who was starving. He ate like a man who understood that food was a gift, every time, no matter how small. "My name is William," the man said between bites. "William Porter," Robert said. He did not give his last name. Robert Sterling was a name that opened doors and attracted attention, and he did not want either of those things right now. He just wanted to sit in a warm diner and watch this man eat and feel, for reasons he did not understand, that this was the most important thing he had done in a very long time. They talked, or rather, William talked, and Robert listened. William told him that he had been on the streets for 3 years. Before that, he had been a carpenter. He had owned a small business, nothing fancy, just him and a truck and his tools. He had a wife. They were married for 31 years. She got sick, cancer. The medical bills ate through their savings, then their retirement, then their house. She died on a Tuesday morning in April, and within 6 months, William had lost everything. The business, the house, the truck, the tools. The life they had built together over 3 decades, dismantled by grief and debt and the merciless machinery of a system that has no category for a 62-year-old man, whose only skill is building things with his hands, and whose heart is too broken to pick up a hammer. Robert listened to this story and felt something unfamiliar. Not pity. Pity is what you feel from above, looking down. This was different. This was lateral. This was one human being recognizing another human being's pain as real and valid, and not so different from his own, despite the billion-dollar gulf between them. When the meal was finished, William leaned back in his chair and smiled a genuine smile, a warm smile, the smile of a man who had just eaten a hot meal on a cold night and was grateful for it in a way that Robert had never been grateful for anything. "You are an angel," William said. Robert shook his head. "No," he said. "I am just a businessman." William's smile did not fade. He looked at Robert with those clear, peaceful eyes. The eyes that should not have been peaceful. The eyes that belonged to a man who had lost everything and should have been bitter or broken or both. And he said, "You know what, Robert? Can I ask you something?" Robert nodded. William leaned forward. "Are you happy?" The question was quiet. Simple. 5 words. And it landed in Robert's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples in every direction, disturbing the carefully maintained surface of a life that looked perfect from the outside and was drowning on the inside. What William said next would haunt Robert for weeks. "Of course I am happy," Robert said. The words came out automatically, the way answers come out when you have been rehearsing them your whole life without knowing it. The way a man who has built a career on projecting confidence can produce the sound of confidence, even when the substance of it is completely absent. "Of course I am happy." It was not a lie exactly. It was a reflex. The same reflex that made him say, "Great, thanks," when someone asked how he was doing. The same reflex that kept his spine straight, and his handshake firm and his voice steady in board meetings where hundreds of millions of dollars were on the line. The reflex of a man who had learned early that vulnerability was weakness, and weakness was unaffordable. William did not argue. He did not challenge the statement. He did not say, "Really?" or "Are you sure?" or any of the things that a therapist or a friend or a preacher might say to push past the surface. He just looked at Robert. He looked at him the way you look at someone you care about when you know they are not telling the truth, but you love them too much to force them into honesty before they are ready. And then he said, very gently, "Eyes do not lie, my friend. Eyes never lie." That was it. That was all he said. And then he picked up his coffee and took a sip and changed the subject, asking Robert about his business, about how the city had changed, about the weather. Small talk, easy talk, the kind of talk that fills the space between two strangers who have temporarily shared warmth and food and will soon go back to their separate worlds. They parted outside the diner. Robert gave William his cashmere scarf, a gesture that surprised Robert as much as it surprised William, and William took it with a thank you that carried the same weight as a prayer. He watched William walk away into the snowy night, thin blanket around his shoulders, Robert's expensive scarf around his neck, moving slowly but steadily, like a man who knew exactly where he was going, even if where he was going was a doorway or a bench or a patch of sidewalk out of the wind. Robert went home. He rode the elevator 63 floors. He walked into his penthouse. He poured his whiskey. He stood at his window, and he could not stop hearing it. Eyes do not lie, my friend. He looked at his reflection in the glass. The window at night acted like a mirror. You could see yourself superimposed over the city, a transparent ghost floating among the lights. He looked at his own eyes, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not look away. He looked. He really looked. And he saw what William had seen. He saw exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. He saw loneliness that no amount of company could reach. He saw the hollow, polished surface of a man who had optimized every external metric of success and had never once asked himself whether the life he was building was the life he actually wanted. You saw the eyes of a man who had not been happy in years, maybe decades, maybe ever. The whiskey tasted wrong. He poured it down the sink. He went to bed. He did not sleep. Are you happy? The question followed him through Christmas Day, which he spent alone in the penthouse, eating Thai food from a delivery app and watching the snow fall on the city. It followed him through the week between Christmas and New Year's, through meetings and calls, and the relentless rhythm of business that never paused for holidays or existential crises. It followed him into the shower, where he stood under water so hot it turned his skin red, and tried to wash the question off like dirt. It would not wash off. It sat in his chest, heavy and immovable, like a stone that had been placed there by careful hands. And around that stone, other questions began to gather. When was the last time you laughed? Not the performative laugh of a business dinner, a real laugh, the kind that makes your eyes water and your stomach hurt. He could not remember. When was the last time someone touched you? Not a handshake, not a pat on the back. Actual human touch, a hand held, an arm around a shoulder, an embrace that lasted long enough to mean something. He could not remember that either. When was the last time someone needed you? Not your money, not your connections, not your name or your signature or your approval. You, the person underneath all of it. The boy from Queens who used to help his mother carry grocery bags up 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken and she was tired, and he was the only one who noticed. No one needed him. Not really. His company had a management team that could run itself. His board had contingency plans for his departure. His children had written him off. His ex-wife had moved on. He was the most replaceable, irreplaceable man in America. He thought about William. He thought about the peace in those eyes, the gratitude in that smile, the warmth in that voice. A man who had lost his wife, his home, his business, his entire life. A man who slept on sidewalks and ate at shelters and owned nothing but a thin blanket and a patched coat. And he had something that Robert, with all his billions, did not have. He had peace. How? How was that possible? What did William know that Robert did not? What did he have that Robert did not? The question nagged at him like a toothache. It was there when he woke up and when he lay down. It was there in meetings where people said Mr. Sterling in reverent tones, and he thought, that is not my name. That is my brand. My name is Bobby. My mother called me Bobby. No one calls me Bobby anymore. New Year's came and went. January ground forward, cold and gray. The acquisition deal moved ahead. The stock price ticked up. The machine kept running. And Robert kept standing at his window every night, looking at his reflection, hearing the voice of a homeless man who had seen through him in 30 seconds flat. Eyes do not lie, my friend. On the second Saturday of January, Robert did something he had not done in years, something that his assistant, his board, his children, His ex-wife and every person who thought they knew Robert Sterling would have found utterly inexplicable. He went looking for William. He put on a plain coat, not the cashmere, something simpler that he found in the back of a closet, and he walked out of his building and into the January cold. And he went back to 53rd Street, back to the spot where he had found William on Christmas Eve. And he stood there on the sidewalk like a man who had lost something precious and was retracing his steps, hoping to find it again. William was not there. Of course he was not. Homeless people do not stay in one place. They move. They follow the weather, the shelters, the soup kitchens, the invisible geography of survival that the housed population never sees. Robert stood on that cold sidewalk, and he felt foolish and desperate and more honest than he had felt in 20 years. And he did not go home. He kept looking. Robert tried to forget William, but fate had other plans. Robert walked for 3 hours that Saturday. He did not know the geography of homelessness, the shelters, the soup kitchens, the churches that opened their doors, the bridges and tunnels where people gathered when the temperature dropped. He was a man who had spent 30 years in Manhattan and knew every steakhouse and every boardroom and every private club, and he did not know where the hungry ate. He did not know where the cold went to get warm. That ignorance shamed him in a way that no business failure ever had. He walked down 7th Avenue. He walked through Times Square, which was gaudy and indifferent. He walked through Hell's Kitchen, past bodegas and laundromats and brownstones that were slowly being replaced by glass towers. He looked at every person sitting on every sidewalk and every bench, searching for a face he had seen for less than an hour on a single night. He did not find William. He went home exhausted and frustrated and strangely more alive than he had felt in years, because searching for something, genuinely searching, with your feet and your time and your discomfort, does something to you. It wakes up a part of you that comfort has put to sleep. He went out again on Sunday and Monday evening after work, and Tuesday. He started learning things. He learned that there was a shelter on 10th Avenue that served dinner at 6. He learned that there was a church on West 46th that opened its basement on cold nights. He learned that there was a woman named Rosa who ran a soup kitchen out of a storefront on 9th Avenue, open every day, no questions asked, funded entirely by donations and Rosa's personal refusal to let anyone go hungry in her neighborhood. He talked to people, not the way a businessman talks to people with an agenda, a desired outcome, a calculation of what can be gained. He talked to them the way a human being talks to other human beings, when the walls of status and wealth and self-protection have been cracked open just enough to let genuine curiosity through. He heard stories. A veteran who had done 3 tours and come home to find that home did not want him back. A woman who had been a school teacher for 20 years until a mental health crisis cost her everything. A young man who had aged out of foster care at 18 with a garbage bag of belongings and no one in the world to call. Every story was different. Every story was the same. A life that had been whole, broken by forces that could break anyone. And then the long, invisible slide into a world that most people walk past without seeing. Robert saw them now. He could not unsee them. That door, once opened, would not close. On Thursday evening, 4 days into his search, he found William. It happened the way God tends to arrange things, not dramatically, not cinematically, but simply, quietly, in a way that you would miss entirely if you were not paying attention. Robert was walking past a small church on West 48th Street. It was not a grand church. No towering spire, no famous congregation. A narrow brick building, wedged between a dry cleaner and a nail salon, with a hand-painted sign that read, Hope Community Church, all welcome. The front door was open. Yellow light spilled out onto the sidewalk, and through the open door, Robert could see a long folding table covered in aluminum pans, and a line of people moving slowly past the table, receiving food on paper plates, and behind the table, wearing an apron that was too big for him and a smile that was exactly as warm as Robert remembered, was William. He was serving mashed potatoes. His movements were practiced and generous, a big scoop for everyone, an extra scoop for anyone who looked like they needed it, and for each person, a word, a greeting, a name, often. "Hey, Marcus. Good to see you, Diane. How is your knee, Frank?" He knew them. They knew him. This was not a one-time act of charity. This was a community, and William was part of it. Robert stood on the sidewalk and watched through the open door, and something in his chest released. A tension he had been carrying for 2 weeks, the anxiety of searching, the fear that he would never find this man again, let go. And in its place was something that felt dangerously close to joy. He walked in. William looked up from the mashed potatoes. Their eyes met, and William's face broke into a grin so wide and so genuine that it seemed to reorganize the entire room around it. Well, he said, "My angel from Christmas Eve." Robert smiled. It was not the polished smile he used in meetings. It was a helpless smile. The smile of a man who has been caught doing something he cannot explain. "I am not an angel," he said. William set down the serving spoon and came around the table and did something that no one had done to Robert in longer than he could remember. He hugged him. A full, firm, unhesitating embrace. The kind of hug that does not ask permission because it does not occur to the hugger that permission might be needed. Robert stood stiff for a moment, the way a person does when they have forgotten what it feels like to be held. And then something in him gave way, and he hugged William back. They sat together after the serving was done. The church fellowship hall was simple folding chairs, fluorescent lights, a cross on the wall that looked like it had been carved by hand. People lingered over their meals, talking, laughing. A few children ran between the tables. An old woman was playing hymns on an upright piano in the corner, the keys yellowed and slightly out of tune, the music more beautiful for its imperfection. Robert looked at William across the table. He said the thing he had come to say, the question that had brought him out of his penthouse and into the January cold and through 4 days of searching. "You have nothing," Robert said, "and I do not mean that as an insult. I mean it as a fact. You sleep on the street. You eat at shelters. You do not have a home or a car or a bank account. You have nothing, and yet you are the most at peace of anyone I have ever met. How? How is that possible?" William leaned back in his folding chair. He was quiet for a moment, not because he did not know the answer, but because he was choosing how to give it. Then he smiled, that same peaceful smile, and he said, "You are wrong, Robert. I have everything. I have God's love. And if you have that, you cannot be poor. No matter what the world takes from you, no matter what the bank account says, no matter where you lay your head at night, you are rich. You are the richest person alive because you have the one thing that money cannot buy and death cannot take away." Robert stared at him. He wanted to argue. The businessman in him wanted to point out that God's love did not keep you warm in a snowstorm, that God's love did not pay medical bills, that God's love did not prevent you from losing your wife and your home and ending up on a sidewalk on Christmas Eve with a blanket that could not keep out the cold. But he did not argue because he was sitting across from the evidence. William had all of those terrible things happen to him, and he was radiating something that Robert, with his penthouse and his jet and his billions, could not produce, could not purchase, could not engineer. Peace. Real, deep, unshakable peace. The kind that does not depend on circumstances. The kind that exists not because everything is fine, but because the person who has it knows something that transcends whether things are fine or not. Robert was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I want that. I do not know how to get it, but I want it." William reached across the table and put his hand on Robert's arm. "That is the first honest thing you have said since I met you," he said. and his eyes were gentle. And Robert, for the first time in his adult life, did not feel like he needed to pretend. William's invitation would change Robert's life forever. "Come to church on Sunday," William said. It was the simplest invitation in the world. 5 words. No pressure, no sales pitch, no promise of transformation or healing or breakthrough or any of the language that Robert associated with religious people trying to get something from you. Just come to church on Sunday. Robert spent the next 2 days talking himself out of it. He was not a church person. He had not been a church person in decades. He associated church with guilt and obligation and the vague memory of incense and Latin, and his mother's hand squeezing his during prayers he did not understand. The megachurches he had interacted with as a donor were corporate operations, slick, produced, performative. The pastors who called him were fundraisers in clerical clothing. The events he attended were networking opportunities disguised as worship. He had written the check and kept his distance and considered that arrangement satisfactory for everyone involved. But William's church was not that. Robert knew this because he had stood in its doorway and watched mashed potatoes being served with love, and he had felt the warmth of the room the way you feel heat from a fire. Not because you understand the chemistry of combustion, but because your body, which has been cold, knows warmth when it encounters it. On Sunday morning, Robert put on a suit. Then he took it off. Then he put on a different suit. Then he took that off too. He stood in his closet, a walk-in the size of most people's bedrooms, lined with clothes organized by color and season and occasion. And he did not know what to wear to a church where people served mashed potatoes to the homeless and a piano player knew hymns by heart. He settled on a blazer and slacks, still expensive, still unmistakably the clothing of a man with money, but less armor than the full suit. He arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the rental car he had taken instead of his usual town car. He watched people go in. They came in 1s and 2s and small groups. They were dressed simply. Some of them were clearly people from the neighborhood, working people, tired people, people whose clothes were clean but not new. Some of them were people from the shelter Robert recognized, a few faces from his week of searching. They all walked through the same door. There was no VIP entrance, no reserve seating, no special treatment for anyone. Robert went in. The sanctuary was the same fellowship hall where the meals were served, rearranged. The folding tables were pushed to the sides. The folding chairs were set up in rows, facing a small wooden podium. The cross was still on the wall. The piano was still in the corner. There were maybe 70 people, maybe 80. Robert had funded church buildings that held 5,000. He had attended galas in ballrooms that could seat 1,000. This room was smaller than his living room, and it was the fullest room he had ever been in. Not full of people, full of something else. He could feel it the moment he sat down, a warmth that had nothing to do with the heating system, a presence that had nothing to do with the number of bodies in the room, a quality of attention, of openness, of collective anticipation, as if every person in every folding chair was genuinely expecting something to happen and genuinely believed it would. William found him. He slid into the chair next to Robert and clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You came." "I came," Robert said. The worship was unlike anything Robert had experienced. There was no band, no production, no screens, just the piano and a woman with a microphone who sang with her eyes closed and her hands raised, and a voice that cracked on the high notes and was more beautiful for the cracking. The congregation sang along. Not all of them could carry a tune. It did not matter. They sang like people who meant it, like people who were not performing worship, but were actually worshiping, pouring out something real from a place inside them that Robert had never accessed and did not know how to reach. He stood among them. He did not sing. He did not know the words. He just stood there and let the sound wash over him and felt, for the first time, the full weight of his emptiness. Because in the presence of genuine fullness, emptiness becomes impossible to deny. The pastor was a man named James Walker, mid-50s, average height, average build, a face that was kind without being soft. He wore no robe, no collar, no vestments. He wore khakis and a button-down shirt, and he stepped up to the wooden podium with a Bible so worn that the binding was held together with a rubber band. He opened it to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, verse 16. The story of the rich young ruler. Robert did not know it was coming. William did not know either. Pastor James had not tailored his sermon to the well-dressed stranger in the third row. He had planned this sermon weeks ago, part of a series on the teachings of Jesus. But God's timing is never accidental. A man came up to Jesus and asked, "Good teacher, what good thing must I do to have eternal life?" Pastor James read the passage slowly. He read about how Jesus told the young man to keep the commandments, and the young man said he had kept them all since he was a boy. And then Pastor James read the verse that entered Robert's chest like a blade. Jesus answered, "If you want to be perfect, go, sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." When the young man heard this, he went away sad because he had great wealth. Pastor James closed his Bible. He looked at the congregation, and he said the saddest sentence in the whole New Testament is not about the cross. It is not about betrayal. It is not about death. The saddest sentence in the whole New Testament is he went away sad because he had great wealth. Because that young man was standing in front of Jesus, the answer to every question he would ever have, the source of every joy he would ever need, and he could not let go of the one thing standing between him and the life he was meant to live. And he walked away. He walked away from God. Not because he did not believe, not because he did not want what Jesus was offering, but because the cost was too high. The possessions he held were holding him, and he could not open his hands. Robert sat in that folding chair, and he could not move. He could not breathe. His hands were gripping the sides of the chair so hard that his knuckles were white. Because he was the rich young ruler. He was the man standing in front of Jesus with great wealth, being asked to let go. And he knew with a certainty that cut through every defense and every rationalization and every excuse he had ever made, that this was not a coincidence. This was not a random sermon on a random Sunday in a random church. This was God speaking directly to him through a pastor in khakis in a fellowship hall that smelled like mashed potatoes, saying the same thing he said 2,000 years ago. Let go. Follow me. After the service, Robert found William in the fellowship hall. People were milling about, drinking coffee, talking. Children were playing. Someone was already setting up tables for the evening meal. The ordinary, unglamorous, ceaseless work of a church that existed not for itself, but for others. Robert's voice was not steady. His eyes were not dry. He said, "I want what you have, William. I want that peace. I do not know how to get it, but I know I do not have it, and I know I need it, and I am tired of pretending otherwise." William put both hands on Robert's shoulders and looked him in the eye. The same clear, peaceful eyes, the same unhurried warmth. "You do not have to earn it, Robert," he said. "That is the whole point. You cannot earn it. You just have to receive it. But first, you have to let go of whatever you are holding so tightly that your hands are not open to receive." Robert knew what he was holding. He had always known. What Robert did next would shock everyone who knew him. Robert did not go home after church. He walked for hours through Central Park, across the great lawn where the snow had turned the landscape into something clean and uncluttered, down paths where joggers and dog walkers moved past him, and none of them knew that the man in the blazer was carrying the weight of a decision that would reshape his entire life. He walked until the sun went down and the park lights came on, and the cold drove him inside. Then he went to his penthouse, and he sat in the dark. He did not turn on the lights. He did not pour a drink. He sat on his $10,000 bed in his 6,000 square foot apartment on the 63rd floor of a building that bore his company's logo. And he was quiet. On the nightstand was the journal Claire had given him for Christmas. He picked it up. He opened it to the first blank page, and he wrote. He wrote for 3 hours. He wrote about his mother and the Catholic Church in Queens, and the way she used to press her rosary beads between her fingers and whisper prayers that he pretended not to hear. He wrote about his father, who worked himself to death and died of a heart attack at 59 in the front seat of his cab, and how Robert had spent his entire career trying to build enough wealth to ensure he would never die the way his father did. Poor, exhausted, forgotten. He wrote about his marriage, which had started with love and ended with lawyers. And the moment he realized he had treated his wife the same way he treated an underperforming asset, something to be managed, optimized, and eventually divested. He wrote about David and Sarah, his children, and the birthday parties he had missed, and the school plays he had been late to, and the slow, terrible realization that his children did not hate him. They had simply stopped expecting him to show up. And somewhere in the third hour, he stopped writing about the past and began writing about the present. And what he wrote was this: I have spent 30 years building something that means nothing. I have spent 30 years gaining what the world values and losing what God values. I have been the rich young ruler my entire life, walking away, always walking away from Jesus, from love, from everything real, because I was afraid that if I let go of what I had, I would have nothing. But I already have nothing. I have $2.3 billion and I have nothing. And then, at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that was shaky because his hand was shaking, because his whole body was shaking, he wrote, God, if you are real, if you are listening, I am ready to let go. I do not know how, but I am ready. He closed the journal. He got off the bed, and he knelt on the floor. Robert Sterling had not knelt since he was a boy in that church in Queens. Kneeling did not come naturally to a man who had spent his life making sure he was always the tallest person in the room, literally and figuratively. But he knelt on the hardwood floor of a penthouse that cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. He put his knees down and his head down, and he said, out loud, into the dark, empty apartment, the words of a prayer that was not polished or eloquent or impressive. God, he said, I have everything, and I have nothing. I am the richest man in the room, and I am bankrupt. I have gained the whole world, and I have lost my soul. And I do not want to live like this anymore. I do not want to be the man who walks away. I want to be the man who follows. Whatever it costs, whatever you ask, I will do. Just show. Please, show me what to do with all of this. Show me what it is for. There was no audible response, no flash of light, no dramatic sign. The apartment remained dark and silent and empty. But something shifted in the silence, in the darkness, in the place where Robert Sterling knelt on a cold floor with tears on his face. Something shifted. It was as if a door that had been locked for 30 years, locked from the inside by Robert himself, with chains he had forged from ambition and fear, and the desperate need to never be poor like his parents. That door cracked open, just a crack, just enough to let in a sliver of something that felt like morning light feels when it falls across your face and wakes you from a long, troubled sleep. He stayed on his knees for a long time. When he finally got up, the city was quiet. It was after 3 in the morning. He walked to the window, his usual spot, his nightly ritual. But he did not pour a drink. He did not look at his reflection. He looked at the city, and for the first time, he did not see lights. He saw people, millions of them, sleeping, waking, working, struggling, hoping, giving up. Millions of people who needed something that money could not buy. And he had so much money. He had so much money. The next morning, Robert called his attorney, Gerald Whitman, senior partner at one of the most prestigious firms in New York. A man who had structured deals worth billions, who had navigated regulatory labyrinths and corporate warfare with surgical precision. A man who was utterly unprepared for what his most important client was about to say. "Gerald," Robert said, "I need you to begin the process of liquidating my personal assets. All of them. The penthouse, the houses, the cars, the yacht, the jet, everything." The silence on the other end of the phone lasted long enough for Robert to count to 7. Then Gerald said, in the careful voice of a man who suspects he may be speaking to someone in crisis, "Robert, are you feeling all right?" "I have never felt better in my life," Robert said. And then he told Gerald what he wanted to do with the money. And the silence lasted much longer than 7 seconds. And Robert smiled a real smile, the first one in years, because he knew that what he was doing looked like madness from the outside. And he also knew, with a certainty that had settled into his bones overnight like something that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged, that it was the sanest thing he had ever done. Robert's family thought he had lost his mind. The news broke on a Wednesday. Robert had wanted to handle things quietly. The liquidation of assets, the restructuring of the company, the establishment of the charitable trust. But in the age of digital information, nothing involving a billionaire stays quiet. A financial journalist at a major outlet got wind of the story through a source at Robert's own firm. The headline read, "Tech billionaire liquidates personal fortune. Mental health questions raised." By Thursday morning, it was everywhere. Every business network, every news site, every social media platform. Robert Sterling's face was on screens across the country, and the narrative had already been written by people who did not know him and had never met him and were not interested in the truth. The truth was too strange, too inconvenient, too threatening to a culture that measures human value in net worth and cannot process a person voluntarily surrendering it. So the narrative became simpler, more digestible, more comfortable. The man had lost his mind. The phone calls started before Robert finished his morning coffee. His CFO, his board members, his publicist, his ex-wife's attorney, his attorney's attorney. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a concern. Everyone had a reason why Robert needed to stop what he was doing immediately, before irreparable damage was done. But the hardest calls came from his children. David called first. David, who was 24 and worked in finance. Robert's world. The world Robert had trained him for. The world that measured a man by his portfolio was furious. He did not ask his father why. He did not ask what had happened. He said, "Dad, I'm going to be direct with you. If you go through with this, we are going to petition for a conservatorship. I have already spoken with a judge." The word conservatorship hit Robert like a slap. His own son was threatening to have him declared mentally incompetent, to have a court strip him of the right to make his own financial decisions, to use the legal system to prevent his father from giving away money that David considered his inheritance. "David," Robert said, "I understand this is hard to understand. Give me a chance to explain." "I do not need an explanation," David said. "I need a psychiatrist to evaluate you, because no sane person gives away $2 billion. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very gently, "David, when was the last time we had dinner together?" The question caught his son off guard. "What?" he said. "When was the last time we sat across from each other and ate a meal and talked? Not about money, not about business, just talked." The silence on the other end was the answer. David hung up. Sarah was different. She cried. She called an hour after David, and from the moment Robert answered, he could hear the tears in her voice. She did not threaten legal action. She did not talk about inheritance. She said, "Daddy, I am scared. I do not understand what is happening to you." And the word daddy, a word she had not used since she was 10, a word that came from a part of their relationship that Robert thought he had killed, with years of absence and neglect, that word broke something in him. "Sweetheart," he said, "I know this does not make sense to you right now, and I know I have not given you any reason to trust me. I have been a terrible father. I chose work over you every single time. I chose money over you. I chose the company over you, and I cannot undo that. But I can stop doing it. I can stop letting the things I own determine the kind of man I am. That is what this is about. I am trying to become someone worth being your father." Sarah was quiet. Then she said in a small voice, "Are you joining a cult?" Robert almost laughed. "No, babe. I am joining a church." "Same thing," she said, and there was the ghost of her mother's humor in the words. And Robert loved her fiercely in that moment, loved her the way he should have loved her every day for 22 years. The business world was less personal and more vicious. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting. Robert was asked to step down as CEO pending a comprehensive health evaluation. They did not say they thought he was crazy. They said they were concerned about his well-being and wanted to ensure that the company's leadership was stable. It was corporate language for, "We think you are crazy." Media coverage intensified. Commentators debated his mental state on television. A famous psychiatrist who had never met Robert offered a remote diagnosis of possible manic episode. An op-ed in a business magazine called it the most public breakdown in corporate history. Former colleagues expressed concern in interviews that were really opportunities to position themselves as potential successors. Everyone had an opinion about Robert Sterling's money. No one asked about Robert Sterling's soul. Through all of it, Robert was calm. Not the forced calm of a man suppressing his emotions. A genuine calm. A calm that surprised him because he had never felt it before. Not in his best business deals. Not in his moments of greatest triumph. Not in any circumstance where the world would have expected him to be at peace. This calm was different. It came from somewhere outside himself. From somewhere above. From the place where his prayer had gone on that night when he knelt on his penthouse floor. He met William for coffee on Saturday, the same diner where they had first sat together on Christmas Eve. William listened to all of it, the children, the board, the media, with that steady, unhurried attention that was his gift. When Robert was done, William said, "You know they did this to Jesus too, right?" Robert looked at him. "His own family thought he was out of his mind," William said. Mark 3, verse 21. "They came to take charge of him because they said he is out of his mind. And the religious leaders said he was possessed by a demon. And the crowds wanted to make him a king, but only on their terms. Everyone had an opinion about what Jesus should do with his power. Nobody understood what he was actually doing." He sipped his coffee. "Sound familiar?" Robert smiled. It was the tired smile of a man under siege, but it was real. "What do I do?" he said. "You keep going," William said. "You have not lost your mind, Robert. You have found it. The difference is that the world cannot tell those two apart. But you can, and God can, and that is enough." Robert nodded. It was enough. William put his hand on Robert's arm across the table. "Can I tell you something?" William said. "What?" "It gets easier," William said. "Not the persecution. That does not stop. People will always misunderstand you when you follow Jesus into places they would never go. But it gets easier to not care, because you start to realize that the opinion of a God who loves you is worth infinitely more than the opinion of a world that does not know you." Robert sat with those words. He let them settle. And in the settling, he felt that calm again, that inexplicable unearned, unshakable calm that had taken up residence in his chest the night he knelt on his penthouse floor and surrendered everything. But the hardest test was yet to come. He moved on a Sunday. The penthouse sold in 11 days, a record for the building, the broker said, as if speed were the relevant detail. The buyer was a hedge fund manager who had no idea what had happened in the space he was purchasing. He did not know that a man had knelt on the hardwood floor of the master bedroom and given his life to God. He would never know. He would put new furniture in the rooms and hang new art on the walls and stand at the same windows, looking at the same lights and feel, perhaps, the same emptiness that Robert had felt. Or perhaps not. That was not Robert's concern anymore. The apartment Robert moved into was on the 4th floor of a walk-up in Washington Heights. It was 800 square feet, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that was also the living room, which was also the dining room. The appliances were old. The radiator hissed. The floors creaked. The walls were thin enough that he could hear his neighbor's television and, in the mornings, the prayers of the elderly Dominican woman next door, who spoke to God in Spanish with a familiarity that suggested they had been friends for a very long time. His belongings fit in 7 boxes. 7 boxes. 30 years of accumulation. And what he chose to keep fit in 7 cardboard boxes carried up 4 flights of stairs by Robert himself, because the building did not have a doorman or an elevator or a porter. He had his clothes a fraction of what he once owned. The simple things, the things he could actually wear and feel like himself in. He had books. He had the journal Claire had given him now, half full of prayers and reflections and the messy, honest record of a man learning to talk to God after decades of silence. He had a few photographs of his parents, his children when they were small, and he had a Bible, a new one, bought at a bookstore near the church. Not expensive, not leather-bound, a simple paperback Bible that he was reading from the beginning, slowly, the way you read something when you are not looking for information but for transformation. He set the Bible on the small table by the window. He looked around the apartment, 800 square feet. A stranger looking at this room would see poverty, downsizing, loss, but Robert, standing in the middle of it with 7 boxes at his feet, saw something different. He saw space. Not physical space, the penthouse had more of that. He saw interior space, room inside himself. For the first time in 30 years, he was not surrounded by things that needed to be maintained, protected, insured, managed, displayed, and worried about. For the first time, the space around him matched the space within him. Clean, simple, unburdened. He had not realized how heavy it all was until he set it down. The weight of possessions, not just the physical weight, but the psychological weight. The constant background calculation of value and maintenance and security. The ambient anxiety of owning things that other people might take or damage or covet. The invisible tax that wealth levies on the soul. The way it makes you suspicious of kindness because you cannot tell if people love you or your money. The way it isolates you in comfort and calls the isolation privilege. Gone. All of it. Gone. And in its place, a lightness that was so unfamiliar, it took Robert several days to identify it. It was freedom. Actual freedom. Not the freedom the world sells, the freedom to buy anything, go anywhere, do anything, which turned out to be just a more expensive cage. This was the freedom Jesus talked about. The freedom that comes from open hands. The freedom of a man who has nothing to protect and therefore nothing to fear. 2 weeks after he moved, Robert was baptized. It was a Sunday afternoon. The sanctuary of Hope Community Church was full, all 70 chairs occupied, a few people standing along the walls. Pastor James had set up a portable baptismal at the front of the room, a simple structure that looked more like a large stock tank than anything you would find in a cathedral. Robert stood at the edge of it in a white t-shirt and shorts, barefoot, feeling every one of his 48 years in his body. The stiffness, The vulnerability, the absurdity of a billionaire standing in a glorified metal tub in a converted fellowship hall in Washington Heights. William was in the front row. He was crying before it even started. William, who had survived the death of his wife and the loss of everything he owned and 3 years on the streets of New York, without losing his faith or his peace. William was sitting in a folding chair, with tears rolling into his white beard, because the man he had met on a sidewalk on Christmas Eve was about to be born again. Pastor James stood in the water. He put one hand on Robert's back and one hand on his chest, and he said, "Robert, do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and your personal Lord and Savior?" "I do," Robert said. And his voice cracked, and he did not care. "Do you commit your life to Him, all of it? Not just the parts that are easy, but all of it." "All of it," Robert said. "Then by the authority of Jesus Christ and the witness of this community, I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." He went under. The water closed over his face. It was cold. It was dark. And in that fraction of a second, that momentary burial, Robert felt the old self die. The man who had walked away from God for 30 years. The man who had chosen money over meaning, success over soul, the approval of the world over the love of a Savior who had been waiting for him since Queens. That man died in a metal tub in a church that smelled like mashed potatoes. And then he came up. He broke the surface of the water and he gasped, and the air filled his lungs, and the light hit his face, and 70 people in folding chairs erupted. They clapped, they shouted, they sang. Some of them barely knew Robert. Some of them had shared meals with him at the serving table. Some of them were homeless. Some of them were working 2 jobs. Every single one of them was cheering for a man they recognized, not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, not as the name on a building, as a brother. Robert stood in the water with his arms raised and his face turned toward the ceiling, and he was crying and laughing, and he said, not to the room, not to William, not to Pastor James, but to God, to the one who had sent a homeless man to a cold sidewalk on Christmas Eve, to ask a rich man the only question that mattered. He said, "I lost everything, and I have never had so much." Robert's new life was about to become his greatest adventure. Within the first week of living in Washington Heights, Robert discovered something about himself that 30 years in business had never revealed. He was good with people, not the way a CEO is good with people, the practiced charm, the strategic empathy, the ability to read a room and say the right thing to get the result he wanted. He was genuinely good with people. He listened, he cared, he showed up, and he had skills. That was the thing that William helped him see. Robert had spent his adult life building businesses. He understood systems, logistics, planning, execution. He understood how to take a vision and turn it into a structure. He understood how to identify a need and build a solution. Those skills did not belong to the corporate world. Those skills belonged to whoever needed them. And the people who needed them most were the people Robert had spent a lifetime walking past. It started small. At the church's weekly meal service, Robert noticed that many of the regulars, men and women, who came for food and fellowship and a warm place to sit, had stories that sounded like William's. They had not always been homeless. They had skills, experience, work histories. They had been carpenters and nurses and teachers and mechanics. They had been taxpayers and homeowners and parents. And then something had broken. A job loss, a medical crisis, an addiction, a divorce, a perfect storm of misfortune that could happen to anyone. And the fall had been swift, and the climb back up had been impossible. Because the world does not build many ladders for people at the bottom. Robert saw the gap, the same way he used to see gaps in the market opportunities where a need existed and no one was meeting it. The need was not charity. These people were not looking for handouts. They were looking for a way back. a way to use the skills they had, a way to learn new ones, a way to rebuild a life that had been dismantled by circumstances they did not choose. Robert went to Pastor James with a plan, a detailed plan, the kind he used to present to boards and investors, with numbers and timelines and projected outcomes. Except instead of revenue projections, the projections were lives changed. Instead of market penetration, the metrics were people housed, people employed, people restored. He wanted to create a center, a place where people experiencing homelessness could come to learn skills that the modern economy demanded: computer literacy, basic coding, digital communication, resume writing, interview preparation, but also more than that: financial literacy, life skill, counseling, community, a place that treated people not as problems to be solved, but as human beings with dignity and potential and stories worth hearing. He would fund it with his remaining assets, the portion of his fortune that had been set aside in the charitable trust. Not all of it. Enough to establish and sustain the center, with a plan for long-term funding through grants and partnerships. He would use his business experience to run it efficiently. He would use his connections, the few that survived his public transformation, to build partnerships with companies willing to hire graduates. He would use his story to attract attention and support. And he would be there, not as a figurehead, not as a name on a letterhead. He would be there every day, teaching, mentoring, doing the work. The New Beginnings Center opened in a leased storefront on Broadway in Washington Heights on a Saturday in March, 4 months after Robert first met William on a cold sidewalk on Christmas Eve. It was not a grand opening. There was no ribbon cutting, no press conference, no champagne. There were folding tables with donated computers on them. There was a whiteboard with a schedule for the first week of classes. There was a coffee station that Margaret had set up, a woman from the church who reminded Robert of his mother and who, like his mother, understood that everything goes better with coffee. There was a hand-painted sign above the door, New Beginnings Center, done by one of the church members, the letters slightly uneven, more beautiful for their imperfection. And there were people. 12 people showed up for the first class. 12 men and women who had seen the flyers at the church and at the shelters and had taken a chance on something that seemed too good to be true. Robert stood in front of them in a simple shirt and jeans, not the blazer, not the slacks, not any remnant of the armor he used to wear, and he said, "My name is Robert. A few years ago, I was the CEO of a company on the NASDAQ. I had more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and I was the loneliest, most lost person I have ever known. Today, I live in a walk-up apartment in this neighborhood. I take the subway. I do my own laundry. And I have more joy in one morning than I used to have in an entire year. I'm telling you this not to impress you, but to say something that I believe to be true. Your circumstances do not determine your worth. What happened to you is not who you are. And today is the first day of whatever comes next." He taught them to use computers, not with the impatience of a tech executive, with the patience of a man who remembered being 16 and learning on a second-hand machine from a pawn shop, trying and failing and trying again. He sat beside them. He guided their hands on the keyboard. He answered every question, no matter how basic, with respect. When a 60-year-old former construction worker named Marcus stared at a blank screen, with the overwhelmed expression of a man who had never touched a computer, Robert did not rush him. He said, "Marcus, you built houses. You took raw materials and turned them into something people could live in. This is the same thing. We are just using different tools." Marcus nodded, and then he typed his name. One letter at a time, slowly, deliberately. Marcus Johnson. And Robert felt something that no stock price, no acquisition, no Forbes ranking had ever given him. He felt useful, not rich, not powerful, not important. Useful in the direct, tangible, human-to-human sense. One person helping another person take a step forward. That was all. And it was everything. The first graduation was 5 months later. 8 of the 12 original students completed the program. They received certificates, simple printed documents, nothing fancy, and they shook Robert's hand. And some of them cried, and Robert cried too because he could not help it. The first graduate to find employment was a woman named Denise. She had been homeless for 2 years. She had been a secretary before her husband left, and the bills swallowed her alive. The New Beginning Center taught her computer skills, helped her rebuild her resume, coached her through interviews, and connected her with a company that was willing to take a chance. She got to call on a Thursday afternoon. She was in the center practicing her typing, and her phone rang, and she answered it. And Robert watched her face change, watched the hope arrive, the disbelief, the joy, and when she hung up, she screamed. She screamed, and she grabbed Robert, and she said, "I got it. I got it. I start Monday." And Robert held this woman, this stranger who had become family, and he thought, this is what it was all for. The money, the career, the 30 years of building. It was all preparation. Preparation for this room, this work, these people, this moment. This is what wealth is for. Not to accumulate, not to display, not to hoard or protect or pass down to children who did not earn it and will not value it. Wealth is for this, for building ladders for people at the bottom, for opening doors that the world has slammed shut, for using everything you have, every skill, every connection, every dollar, every hour in the service of someone who needs it more than you do. Jesus knew that 2,000 years ago. Robert Sterling learned it at 48 in a storefront on Broadway, watching a woman named Denise start her life over. The transformation was not just in Robert, it was in everyone he touched. It has been 3 years. I know this because Robert marks the time not from his birthday or New Year's or the company's founding date the way he used to, but from Christmas Eve, the night he slipped on ice and looked into the eyes of a man who had nothing and everything. 3 Christmases since then. 3 years of a life that no financial analyst would recognize as successful and that Robert would not trade for $100 billion. The New Beginning Center did not stay in one storefront on Broadway. It grew, not because Robert had a growth strategy or a scaling plan or any of the business frameworks he used to swear by. It grew because it worked. People came in broken and came out rebuilt. They came in hopeless and left with jobs and apartments and the beginning of a future they had stopped believing in. And the people whose lives were changed became the people who changed other lives. The first expansion happened almost by accident. A pastor in Brooklyn heard about what Robert was doing and called to ask if he could replicate the model in his neighborhood. Robert drove to Brooklyn, met with the pastor, walked the neighborhood, and within 2 months, a second center was open. Then a church in the Bronx, then one in Newark, then Baltimore, then Philadelphia. Each center was adapted to its community, run by local people, funded by a combination of the trust's resources and local partnerships. Robert provided the framework. The communities provided the heart. Within 2 years, there were 14 centers in 7 cities. Over 2,000 people had completed the program. The employment rate among graduates was 73%. A number that secular workforce development programs spent millions trying to achieve. Robert achieved it with donated computers, volunteer teachers, and a fundamental belief that every human being carries inherent worth that no circumstance can erase. He still lives in the walk-up in Washington Heights. The radiator still hisses. The floors still creak. The neighbor still prays in Spanish every morning. Robert has come to think of her prayers as his alarm clock, the most beautiful alarm clock in the world. The sound of a woman who has been talking to God long enough to speak to him the way you speak to someone who is sitting across the table. He takes the subway. He does his own laundry. He cooks simple meals in a kitchen that is smaller than the walk-in closet he used to have. And he is happy. Not the happiness of a man who has everything he wants. The happiness of a man who wants only what he has. There is a difference so vast between those two states that English barely has the language for it. It is the difference between fullness and overflow, between holding on and letting go, between a closed fist and an open hand. David came first, Robert's son. It took over a year. 14 months of silence, of unreturned calls, of legal threats that eventually faded as the attorneys realized there was no case for conservatorship because Robert was demonstrably sane, more sane, in fact, than he had ever been. David came to the center one afternoon without calling ahead. Robert was in the computer lab helping a student format a resume when he looked up and saw his son standing in the doorway. David looked different. The hardness that had been in his face during their last conversation was gone. In its place was something uncertain, something searching, something that looked like the face of a boy who used to sit on his father's lap and ask questions about how things work. "Dad," he said. And Robert crossed the room and he took his son in his arms and he held him. And David did not resist. He held on. He held on like a man who had been angry for a long time and was exhausted by it. "I do not understand what you did," David said into his father's shoulder. "I still do not, but I have been watching. And whatever this is, whatever happened to you, you are different. You are the father I always wanted and never had, and I want to know him." Robert pulled back and looked at his son's face and said, "I am right here. I am not going anywhere. I have nowhere to go and nothing to do except be here for you. For the first time in your life, I have time. I have nothing but time." David started coming to the center once a week, then twice. He used his financial expertise to help with the books. He helped Robert apply for grants. He sat in on classes and watched his father teach and saw a man he did not recognize. A man with patience and gentleness and a complete absence of the driven, distracted, always somewhere else energy that had defined Robert Sterling for as long as David had known him. Sarah came next. She brought her boyfriend. Then she brought her friends. She started volunteering on Saturday mornings, helping with the center's intake process, interviewing new students, hearing their stories. One evening she called Robert and she said, "Daddy, I think I understand now. What happened to you? I think I understand." "Tell me," Robert said. "You stopped counting," she said. "You spent your whole life counting money, counting returns, counting square footage and stock prices and percentage points. And you stopped. You started seeing people instead of numbers, and it changed everything." Robert closed his eyes. His daughter had articulated something he had been trying to put into words for 3 years. And she had done it in 3 sentences. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what happened." The hardest reconciliation was with his ex-wife, Catherine. That is a story Robert keeps mostly private because it belongs to both of them, and some things are too sacred for public consumption. But what can be said is this: Catherine came to the center. She came because David asked her to. She came expecting to see a man in the grip of a breakdown. She came ready to be angry. And instead, she found a man at peace, a man she barely recognized, a man who looked her in the eye and said, "Catherine, I failed you. In every way a husband can fail a wife. I failed you, and I cannot undo it. But I can tell you that the man who failed you is dead. I buried him in a baptismal tank in Washington Heights, and the man standing in front of you now would like the chance, if you are willing, to be your friend. They are not remarried. That may not be where the story goes, but they are friends, real friends. The kind who call each other on difficult days and share meals on holidays and co-parent adult children with kindness and mutual respect. And that, Robert says, is a miracle as profound as anything else that has happened. On a Tuesday evening in October, almost exactly 3 years after Christmas Eve, Robert and William sat together at the New Beginnings Center. The day's classes were over. The students had gone home or back to the shelters that were, increasingly, transitional stops on the way to somewhere better, not permanent addresses. The center was quiet. Robert had made coffee. Not the good coffee, the cheap coffee. The kind that comes in a red can and tastes like determination. William's favorite. They sat at one of the folding tables. The walls around them were covered with photographs. Graduation photos. Before and after photos. Photos of students at new jobs, in new apartments, with new expressions on their faces. The expression of a person who has been seen, valued, and given a chance. Hundreds of faces. Thousands of stories. Lives rebuilt. Robert looked at the photos. Then he looked at William. William, who was still homeless by choice, he refused Robert's repeated offers of an apartment, insisting that his place was on the streets, where he could be close to the people who needed him most. William, who still served mashed potatoes every week. William, who still had clear, peaceful eyes and a warmth that could fill a room. Robert said, "You were right, my friend." William looked at him. "About what?" "About everything. I am rich now. I am the richest man I know." William smiled. That smile. The same one from Christmas Eve. The same one from the diner. The same one that had somehow, impossibly, been warm enough to melt through 30 years of ice around Robert Sterling's heart. "You always were," William said. "You just did not know it yet." They sat together in the quiet center, drinking bad coffee, surrounded by the evidence of changed lives. And Robert thought about the verse from Matthew that had broken him open in that small church on that first Sunday. The rich young ruler who went away sad because he had great wealth. Robert had been that man. He had been that man for 30 years. And then, by the grace of God and the courage of an old, homeless man who was not afraid to ask a billionaire if he was happy, Robert had made a different choice. He had not gone away sad. He had let go. He had followed. And in letting go of everything the world said mattered, he had found the only thing that actually did. There is a moment in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus says, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." And the disciples, terrified, ask, "Then who can be saved?" And Jesus says, "What is impossible with man is possible with God." Robert Sterling was the camel. The eye of the needle was a storefront in Washington Heights. And the God who made it possible was the same God who has been making impossible things possible since the beginning of time. If you are watching this and your hands are full of money, full of ambition, full of plans, full of anything that you are gripping so tightly that you cannot open your palms to receive what God wants to give you, I want you to hear what Robert Sterling learned. True riches are not measured by what you have. They are measured by what you give. True wealth is not what is in your bank account. It is what is in the lives you have touched. True success is not your name on a building. It is your name known in heaven. And the richest life you will ever live is the one you pour out for others. Robert knows this now. He lives it every day. In a walk-up apartment with a hissing radiator and cheap coffee and a Bible on a small table by the window. He is the poorest billionaire in America and the richest man I have ever known. If this story challenged something in you, if it stirred something, unsettled something, made you look at your own hands and wonder what you are holding so tightly, then let me ask you the same question that a homeless man named William asked a billionaire named Robert on a cold sidewalk on Christmas Eve. Are you happy? Be honest. Your eyes will not lie. And if the answer is no, if the honest answer is no, then maybe it is time to let go. Maybe it is time to open your hands. Maybe it is time to stop counting and start seeing. Because the God who turned a lonely billionaire into a joyful servant is the same God who is looking at you right now. And he is asking gently the way he always asks, will you follow me? It will cost you everything, and it will give you everything. Robert Sterling can tell you, it is worth it.